President Johnson used the authority given to him by the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to expand or escalate US involvement in Vietnam. For the United States, that meant sending combat soldiers to fight with the South Vietnamese against the communist forces of the Vietcong and North Vietnamese army. Johnson hoped that by sending US forces to help, he could keep North Vietnam from quickly defeating South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government and army were weak from years of fighting. Johnson believed sending US troops would give the South Vietnamese time to strengthen their government and armed forces. Then, the South Vietnamese could resume the fighting on their own. By preventing defeat, Johnson believed he was accomplishing his goal of containing communism. When escalating US involvement, President Johnson and his advisors made certain decisions that would shape America's entire war effort. First, the president believed that the United States should fight a limited war, or a war that was kept primarily within the borders of South Vietnam. Although he considered invading North Vietnam, Johnson decided against it. Invading North Vietnam might have caused its allies, China and the Soviet Union, to join the war. Johnson feared that war with China and the Soviet Union could destroy the world. Both of these countries were already aiding North Vietnam with arms and supplies. Johnson believed a limited war would not further antagonize either country. The decision to fight a limited war might have been a good political decision, but it would prove to be a poor military one. By not invading North Vietnam, the communists could never really be defeated, which meant they could keep up the fight in South Vietnam. Limiting the war to South Vietnam created another disadvantage for the United States. China and the Soviet Union shipped supplies to the North Vietnamese communists along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail went through the countries of Laos and Cambodia. The decision to keep the war limited to South Vietnam meant that the United States could not seal off the Ho Chi Minh Trail and stop the flow of arms and supplies to the communists fighting in South Vietnam. If the trail could have been closed, the communists would have had far fewer supplies. That might have made the war end sooner. As it was, communist forces in South Vietnam remained well supplied. The United States planned to fight a war of attrition. This meant that US soldiers would help destroy communist soldiers, supplies, and war-related factories. Ideally, communist forces would be so busy rebuilding that they would be unable to fight. That would give South Vietnam the time it needed to strengthen its government and improve its armed forces. The Ho Chi Minh Trail North Vietnam shipped weapons, supplies, and soldiers to the revolutionary Vietcong soldiers fighting in South Vietnam. Many of these materials were shipped south along a route known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail for many years. The route was named in honor of North Vietnam's revolutionary hero. The Ho Chi Minh Trail extended from North Vietnam through the neighboring country of Laos, then wound its way south through the country of Cambodia before entering South Vietnam from the west. The route was roundabout for a very good reason. By locating this supply route outside of North and South Vietnam in more neutral territory, the communists had a better chance of getting their supplies far to the south where they were needed. The United States knew about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Closing down the trail, however, meant risking the expansion of the Vietnam War into Laos and Cambodia. In the early years of the war, the United States was reluctant to do this, and the supplies poured into South Vietnam. Eventually, the United States dropped bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail to prevent supplies from reaching South Vietnam. But the bombs never closed the trail completely. The communists were able to repair whatever damage the bombs did and keep the route open. The Ho Chi Minh Trail played a large role in the communists' eventual victory in Vietnam. President Johnson and Vietnam Lyndon Baines Johnson became the 36th President of the United States on November 22, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated. The new president immediately faced the decision of what to do in Vietnam. During his re-election campaign in 1964, Johnson warned against increasing American involvement in Vietnam. His stand as a peace candidate helped him win re-election. In 1965, President Johnson reversed this position, ordered bombing in North Vietnam, and sent American troops into battle. The president also dreamed of building a great society in America. He declared unconditional war on poverty. With his leadership, Congress passed laws that helped pay healthcare costs for senior citizens, made it easier for black people to vote, helped the unemployed, expanded the food stamp program for the needy, and made it easier for young people to get jobs. Never had the country seen so much legislation that favored the common citizen, but President Johnson's Great Society was shattered by the Vietnam War. The president was inexperienced in international affairs. His decision to escalate the war would prove to be a costly mistake for the country and himself. Although he insisted that the country could afford both the war and the Great Society program he wanted, his critics claimed that America could not pay for both guns and butter. They were right. His failure to bring a successful resolution to the Vietnam War caused much turmoil in the country and forced cutbacks in the social programs he helped create. His popularity fell, and in 1968 he announced he would not run for re-election. He is remembered more as a war president than the creator of the Great Society. President Johnson died on January 22, 1973, 5 days before the peace treaty was signed that ended America's involvement in Vietnam. But in Vietnam, the United States quickly discovered that it was seldom able to fight a traditional war. First, the decision to fight a limited war prevented the U.S. Army from conquering North Vietnam, which would have been the probable result of a traditional war. But even more important, the Communists' method of warfare prevented the United States from fighting the war in the style with which it was most familiar. What U.S. troops encountered in Vietnam. When the first American combat soldiers landed in Vietnam in March 1965, it seemed like the biblical giant Goliath had crossed the Pacific Ocean to battle David. Compared to the United States, North Vietnam was indeed like David, small and powerless. But like David, the North Vietnamese would prove to be very resourceful. They would prove to be unlike any enemy the United States had ever faced. The Communists avoided the direct combat that the Americans favored. Instead, they launched surprise attacks, or ambush-ors, upon the American and South Vietnamese armies, and then quickly slipped away to hide in the jungle or in the miles of tunnels that honeycombed the hills. The Communists moved quickly through the familiar jungle terrain, shooting at their enemy many times from different places. With shots coming from so many locations, the Americans often believed the Communists' numbers were much higher than they were. Such tactics confused and harassed the Americans. They kept U.S. soldiers on the lookout for attack rather than allowing them to pursue their tactics. The North Vietnamese, even after they had slipped away to hide, used inventive weapons to harass and confuse the Americans. They created booby traps by rigging concealed grenades or landmines to trip wires. When a soldier's foot tripped the wire, it set off the explosive, killing or seriously injuring him. The Communists dug pits and filled them with landmines, covering the pits with leaves so that they looked like solid ground. When a soldier stepped or fell into the pit, the landmine exploded. Other pits were lined with sharpened sticks of bamboo called pungi stakes that cut human flesh like knives. Thorny branches were bent back and attached to tripwires. When triggered, the branches would sweep into the faces of soldiers. Such weapons made the Americans even less effective in the unfamiliar jungle, giving the Communists a distinct advantage. The guerrilla warfare tactics would prove to be far more suitable to the mountainous terrain and dense jungles than the technological weapons the United States used. To offset them, the Americans used chemical herbicides to make trees and bushes drop their leaves and make the enemy more visible. The most well-known chemical was Agent Orange. Napalm, a sticky stance that burned like gasoline, was also used. It was dropped on the landscape and then ignited, turning the countryside into an inferno that destroyed everything in its path. Napalm and Agent Orange were destructive not only to the enemy, but also to civilians, friendly troops, and the countryside itself. These weapons would become very controversial during the war as their destructiveness became known to the world. In addition to the military advantage given them by their guerrilla warfare tactics, the North Vietnamese also had the advantage of a more defined goal than the United States. The North Vietnamese had already been fighting for over 20 years to defeat the South Vietnamese government and reunify North and South Vietnam. Even many South Vietnamese supported and worked toward this goal. Tunnel warfare. The Communist troops built tunnels to hide in and to store their supplies. These tunnels were many layers deep and stretched for miles below the Vietnamese countryside. To fight the North Vietnamese, US soldiers often had to attempt to search and destroy these tunnels in tunnel warfare. Tunnel warfare became one of the most unpopular tasks American soldiers faced. When a tunnel was found, smoke grenades were thrown in to reveal other entrances to the tunnel. Frequently, tear gas grenades were thrown into the tunnel to harass enemy soldiers and drive them outside or down into the lower level. When all was quiet, a soldier known as a tunnel rat donned a gas mask and a bulletproof garment called a flak jacket. He entered the tunnel and slowly worked his way through it, searching for the enemy and their supplies. When the job was finished, the soldiers would blow up or bulldoze the tunnel entrances so the enemy could not use the tunnels again. Tunnel warfare was dangerous and hard on the nerves. The enemy could leap out of the darkness at any moment. US soldiers sometimes skipped searching the tunnel and simply blew up or bulldozed the entrances, trapping the enemy soldiers inside. Since the tunnel systems were so long, it was impossible to be sure every entrance was destroyed. Often the enemy returned and, with a little work, reopened the tunnel for use. The goal was a clear military one, and victory was easier to measure. North Vietnam knew they had won when they defeated South Vietnam. America's goal, however, was to keep South Vietnam from falling, not to invade or defeat North Vietnam. Thus, victory was harder to determine. Finally, the North Vietnamese had devised a plan to wear down the United States' resolve. The North Vietnamese were prepared to fight a very long war. They hoped to wear down the United States so that Americans back home would tire of the war and pressure the US government to withdraw. A decade earlier, the communists had used that strategy to defeat the French. A pattern to the war. The differences in the goals and methods of the United States and North Vietnam caused battles between them to follow a very predictable pattern. The communists made many small attacks, inflicting whatever casualties they could before slipping away. In a single week in July 1965, for example, Time magazine reported that the communists had attacked South Vietnamese or American forces in 9 different locations throughout South Vietnam. But when a more traditional battle occurred, the better-equipped Americans always won. In a battle in the Ia Drang River Valley in November 1965, for example, fewer than 500 Americans defeated more than 3,000 North Vietnamese. The Americans used helicopters to create instant supply lines and moved troops and artillery into better positions as the battlefield shifted. They used bombers to destroy or weaken enemy positions. These high-technology weapons more than compensated for the fact that the Americans were far outnumbered. Unfortunately, the battles and guerrilla attacks always seemed to result in a stalemate. US forces would drive the North Vietnamese out of one area, only to have them return to other areas. US soldiers were never able to see a clear progression in the battles with the North Vietnamese. Although they had suffered very high casualties, the communists were able to replace their losses with new troops recruited from both North and South Vietnam. The communists returned to the villages and countryside after the American and South Vietnamese forces secured them and left. Plus, the communists had the support of many of the South Vietnamese peasants, who allowed them to hide in their homes when necessary. All of these elements offset the battle victories that the United States had scored. This lack of progression led General William Westmoreland, the military commander in charge of US troops in Vietnam, to recommend sending more US soldiers to Vietnam. Almost every month, General Westmoreland requested more troops from Washington. If the United States did not commit more men to Vietnam, the general argued the war would be lost, and South Vietnam would fall to the communists. By the end of 1965, there were over 170,000 US troops in South Vietnam. America's political and military leaders hoped that more troops, more bombs, and more fighting would lead to victory. A grunt's life foot soldiers in Vietnam were nicknamed grunts, for it was they who did the everyday, or grunt, work. In December of 1966, 18-year-old Marine Private Jim Mason arrived in Vietnam. "I felt I was fulfilling an obligation to my country," he recalled years later, "and I had an opportunity to see what war was like. I remember telling my English teacher back in the spring that I wanted to see what war was like." Private First Class Mason soon found out. 2 weeks after his arrival, his unit was sent out into the field, or in-country as the soldiers called it. He was sent to a base camp near the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, the neutral area along the border between North and South Vietnam. That very night he went out on his first patrol. It was the middle of January, rainy and cold. We set up in the rain. I remember the raindrops made such a loud noise on my poncho, like drum beats. I was excited and scared at the same time. Just being out there at night was scary. We were sitting in some pineapple bushes and I saw movement. I nudged the guy next to me and whispered that I had seen something move. He whispered back, "Don't shoot. They leave us alone at night, and we leave them alone." That was my first encounter with the enemy. There would be many such encounters with the enemy, and some with the actual fighting as Mason's life in the country settled into a new routine. He went out on patrol for about 4 hours almost every night. There were other patrols during the day. When not on patrol, his unit went about other duties. They went to the river to get drinking water and to wash the clothes they were wearing. The supply truck came, bringing mail, food, clothing, ammunition, and replacement soldiers. While in the country, Mason ate cold sea rations out of cans of spaghetti and meatballs or beans and franks, sometimes fruit. And there were crackers and cheese, always crackers and cheese. When there was no work to do, he often played cards with other soldiers to help pass the time and relieve the boredom. During a 24-hour period, if he was lucky, Mason could get about 8 hours of sleep or 4 hours at night and catnaps during the day. Often, Mason thought about how different being in the country was from anything he had ever known. I was away from home, away from the service routine that I knew, and the war was completely new to me. Mason felt a routine sense of danger that made his shoulders tighten with tension. He was always on the watching for movements in the night, listening for the snap of a twig or some other warning of his next encounter with an enemy he would rarely see. Frustration, tension, and the boredom of waiting to do his job were his constant companions. American troops began to take over more of the fighting from the South Vietnamese. At the end of 1966, 320,000 Americans were serving in combat and support roles in Vietnam. More than 6,400 Americans had been killed. By September of 1967, US troops serving in Vietnam had increased to 464,000. In October, American casualties passed the 13,000 mark. A military stalemate in 1967, General Westmoreland met privately with President Johnson and delivered disturbing news. He told him that the war had reached a stalemate even though enemy casualties were far higher than American casualties, and that the United States had won every major battle. Westmoreland concluded that even if thousands of additional troops were sent to Vietnam, the war could drag on another 3 years. At the end of 1967, historian Gabriel Kolko wrote, "It was becoming increasingly obvious that the North Vietnamese soldiers' ability to adapt to each US escalation had created a military stalemate. In a sense, this stalemate had existed since the United States escalated its involvement in the war in 1965. The United States knew only one way to fight a war: high-technology weapons and large armies. Whenever the United States determined that something more had to be done to prevent South Vietnam from losing, it simply did more of what it was already doing, using more soldiers, bombs, and fighting, hoping to turn the war around. Even when it became obvious that this strategy was not working, the Americans could not afford to discontinue their war efforts and take time to rethink their tactics. To stop fighting would surely allow the communists to win. If the communists were ever to be defeated, Johnson and his advisors had little choice but to keep the stalemate going while they decided what else to do. US military forces were becoming demoralized and confused. They had been taught to fight and to win, but victory seemed a long way off. Their military leaders did not seem to want them to win. American soldiers were no longer sure why they were in Vietnam or what they were fighting for. On Christmas Day, 1967, US Marine Jim Mason's tour of duty ended, and he left Vietnam for the United States. I felt no sense of accomplishment other than my friends and I had helped each other to survive. We didn't act to help our country, but to save our buddies. His frustrations were shared by many American soldiers serving in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive. What was a bad military situation for the United States was a good one for the Communists. Vo Nguyen Giap, the commander of the Communist forces, sensed that the time was right for a major military attack. Giap began preparing for the attack in the early days of 1968 by moving troops and supplies into positions throughout South Vietnam. On January 21st, the Communists attacked the American base and airplane runway of Khe Sanh near the DMZ, the neutral area along the border between North and South Vietnam. Khe Sanh was an important base for the Americans. From there, US forces could monitor enemy activity along the DMZ and the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. The Communists were soon beaten back by American forces. The Communists then followed the attack with a barrage of artillery fire that damaged the runway, destroyed the main ammunition stores, and damaged some aircraft. They built a network of positions around the base and renewed their attack upon Khe Sanh and American positions in surrounding areas. As weather conditions allowed, the Americans retaliated with airstrikes that hammered Communist positions. The Americans also began to airlift replacement munitions and supplies into the base. US air and artillery power prevented the base from falling. Hearts and minds. While warfare raged in the jungles and fields of South Vietnam, another kind of battle raged throughout the country, the battle to win the support of the South Vietnamese peasants. It became known as the Battle for Hearts and Minds. The Americans knew that the Communists depended on peasant cooperation. Peasants gave the Communists information about the enemy, shared food and other supplies, and provided them a place to hide when the enemy was near. To the peasants, the Communists represented an alternative to the unpopular South Vietnamese government. Between 1954 and his death in 1963, the South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem turned the peasants against his government through oppressive rule and unfair land reform programs. The government of his eventual successor, Nguyen Van Thieu, was just as unpopular. The Americans themselves were often automatically disliked by many peasants because they supported the South Vietnamese government. American dropped bombs also destroyed villages and farms, making it hard for the peasants to grow enough food to survive. Because the Americans were unsuccessful in building support among the peasants, they were also unsuccessful in eliminating support for the Communists. The United States created a special program called Operation Phoenix to seek out the people who supported the enemy in the rural areas and eliminate that support. Too often, eliminating Communist supporters simply meant killing them. An estimated 20,000 suspected enemy supporters were killed during Operation Phoenix. However, the program alienated far more peasants than it eliminated potential enemies. The Communists had programs of their own that eliminated anyone suspected of aiding the Americans and the South Vietnamese government. They often terrorized the peasants into supporting them with threats and brutal beatings. Thousands of peasants were killed by the Communists as well. The peasants were caught in the middle between both sides. As the war progressed, they suffered terribly into Communist hands. The Communists launched attacks on February 17, 18, and 29 that were driven back with US bombs, rockets, and artillery. But the siege of Khe Sanh was not Giap's main offensive target, as Americans had first thought. It may only have been a diversion. 10 days after the first attack on Khe Sanh, the Communists launched surprise attacks on major cities in South Vietnam and most American bases and airfields. The attacks began at dawn on January 30, 1968, the first day of Tet, the traditional Vietnamese New Year. Tet had been a time of truce in previous years of the war. Because American attention was focused on the developing battle at Khe Sanh, Giap and the Communists managed to take South Vietnam by surprise. Fierce fighting. Most of the attacks were beaten back within hours, but others were repelled only after days or weeks of fierce fighting. In the capital city of Saigon, for example, 19 Vietcong commandos attacked the American embassy. 2 American guards were killed at the beginning of the attack. Other guards held off the commandos until more soldiers and supplies could be helicoptered in. All the commandos had been killed by mid-morning, and the embassy was secured again. 5 Americans had been killed. At home, Americans were shocked and outraged by the attack on what they felt was American soil. Elsewhere in Saigon, the Communists attacked the South Vietnamese presidential palace, a local radio station, and the headquarters of the South Vietnamese army. 700 Communists attacked U.S. Commander Westmoreland's compound at the American air base at nearby Tan Son Nhut. The fighting became so intense that Westmoreland ordered his staff to find weapons and join in defending the compound. Before the battle was over and the Communists retreated, 23 Americans were killed and 85 were wounded. 15 aircraft had been damaged. South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu, Diem's successor, declared martial or military law in Saigon on the first day of the attack. It took a week to secure the city again. During heavy fighting in the streets, sections of Saigon were reduced to rubble. The fighting subsided by February 5th as the North Vietnamese army and Vietcong were driven out of the city. Far to the north of Saigon, the city of Hue was also attacked and overrun on the morning of January 31st. One of the Communists' main targets was the Citadel, an ancient palace whose grounds covered about 2 square miles. The Communists raised a Vietcong flag there on the first morning. Elsewhere in the city, Communists freed thousands of people who had been imprisoned by the South Vietnamese government. They also rounded up thousands of Catholics and South Vietnamese government officials. Many were shot because they were considered enemies of the state. Most of the rest simply vanished. American Marines and the South Vietnamese army drove into Hue, advancing block by block in bitter fighting. The citadel was recaptured on February 23rd, and the enemy forces retreated. Collectively, these battles became known as the Tet Offensive. The offensive subsided by April 1968. Once again, the United States had won the battles, but the real victory went to the Communists. The Tet Offensive made the United States realize that it had vastly underestimated its enemy. US government and military leaders were taken almost by complete surprise at the size and force of the Tet Offensive. The offensive convinced an increasing number of America's political and military leaders that US involvement would cost thousands of American lives and would produce nothing more than a stalemate. An end to escalation. In late February of 1968, a gloomy report from America's military headquarters in Vietnam demanded over 100,000 additional men. President Johnson asked his new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, to review the American position in Vietnam before he made any decision on the request. Secretary of Defense Clifford concluded that 100,000 additional troops would not make enough difference to win in Vietnam. The President consulted his closest advisors, a group nicknamed the Wise Old Men. He found that they, too, had turned against the war. In the end, Johnson refused to send the additional men. His refusal signaled the end of America's escalation of the Vietnam War. What the United States would do next was influenced only partly by the failures on the battlefield. At home, the war had divided and changed America. From 1965 to 1968, politicians, mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers escalated a war of their own on America's college campuses, streets, and government buildings. It was a war against the Vietnam War. President Johnson's next steps would have to end 2 wars. He would have to find a new way to bring peace to Vietnam. In doing so, he also would have to find a way to bring peace to America.